Friends, I receive many inquiries as to why, toward the end of the program, I keep looking like this. And some wanted to know if I was staring at an idiot card. An idiot card is a large card that is sometimes held up on which, if a person forgets his name and address, it's written. No, it's because there's a clock here, and I have to finish at the end of 24.5 minutes. And so I watch very closely until the second hand gets toward the appointed minute in order that I may conclude. You see, I don't have notes, nothing is written out, and there are no idiot cards, and so I have to time myself as I go along. Otherwise, I would be like someone in my profession who was delivering a funeral oration over one of the beloved members of his congregation, waxing long and eloquent. Sexton came out, pulled his robe, said, "It's getting late now, getting late. Better stop." And he said, "Oh," he says, "I'm talking on a very vital subject, very vital, the resurrection." Sexton said, "I know, but we got to get our man over there in time for it." Well, this telecast is on guilt. A little girl had been to church and she heard a sermon on the separation of the sheep and the goats. And when her mother put her to bed that night, the little child began to cry, and she said, "Mommy, I'm afraid that I'm a goat." And the mother said, "No, you're not. Bishop Sheen's angel told me that you were a little angel, and if you died, you would go straight to heaven." So the little child was very satisfied, went to sleep. The next night, the mother came in again, and the child was crying, and she said to her mother, "I am still thinking about the sheep and the goats, Mummy." And the mummy said, "I told you, you're not a goat, you're an angel." And the little child said, "All right, Mother, I know, but I'm afraid that maybe you might be a goat." So we'll talk about some of those goats. The word guilt today, you know, is not very popular. One isn't supposed to use it because nobody today is guilty, we're just sick. You have guilt only in an age where there's reason. Did you know that? As long as people think, they believe in conscience, and because they believe in conscience, they will have a sense of guilt. But now, reason is not very popular. If you put your head between your hands to think out something, people ask if you have a headache. And even all of the fruits of our 2,000 years of Christianity today are being bypassed. There's almost a contempt today for philosophy and theology. And why? Well, simply because it's reasonable. And it appeals to the mind. It makes you think. So when you think of a goal or a purpose and how you may miss that goal or purpose, or how you may attain it. And with that comes a sense of peace on the one hand, guilt on the other. But today, we have no sense of guilt or reason. Reason is in disrepute. What's taking the place of it? Emotion, feeling, sentiment. When you have emotion, you have no guilt. First of all, let me show you how much emotion plays a part in our modern world. Take, for example, advertisements. Do you ever see an advertisement in which there is a reason given why you should buy something? As a matter of fact, the more products are alike, the less there is an appeal to reason. Automobiles, detergents, cigarettes, and liquor. Because no reason is given, they will appeal, for example, in cigarette advertisements to, well, you smoke a certain brand of cigarette, it gives you the feeling of being on a horse in the Wild West. Or alongside of a waterfall. Detergents, whoa, there's washing machine 10 feet high. Automobiles, ballet dancers. Hardly ever do you find a reason, so much so that 300 men who smoked 3 different brands of cigarettes were blindfolded. And they were given 3 of these cigarettes to smoke. Only 2% could tell their own brand. 2% out of 300. And this was because they had never been given a reason, nor was there actually a reasonable distinction between them. Take, for example, the subject of news. How much emotionalism creeps into news. We like to hear about people being killed, about wrecks, murders, assaults, rapes. You know, the best news is the breaking of the 10 Commandments. Maybe in a few years it'll be news to keep them, but presently it's news to break them. So that you will hear, for example, an announcement like this. 102 people were killed in the greatest air disaster in history. More details about this terrible accident after a word about Dora, the adorable, adorable ointment. And not only news and not only advertisements, but the appeal to music. I suppose there is nothing that would ever convince a reasonable man as little as singing a song. Suppose a salesman went in to sell a product and began singing. Or suppose the wife came up and started singing to her husband, your wife wants a mink coat, your wife wants a mink coat. Husband would laugh at you. But today, simply because reason amounts to naught, almost all commercials are sung so that the drip, 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 drip on our heads and on our subconsciousness makes us react like animals to a trainer. Now, I'm not passing on the rightness or wrongness of these things. I'm merely speaking about the mood of our times. That's all. Simply because guilt now has passed away with reason, what follows? Guilt has gone down, real guilt, into the subconscious mind. It's not faced, it's hidden. So what do we are faced with up here? We are faced up here with manifestations of guilt that are never recognized as such. So let me tell you something that is happening to the modern mind in terms of a tube of toothpaste. Now, I will not describe the tube of toothpaste or whether it's the brand that gives you 32% fewer cavities or 48 fewer cavities. But a toothpaste has a normal fixture at the top where under pressure the paste will come out. So too the human mind, when it's under the pressure of guilt, has a normal outlet, namely admitting it and seeking pardon. That's like taking the cap off the toothpaste. But now suppose you deny this normal outlet and you keep the cap on. And then you begin to use pressure on this tube. What happens? You don't know where in heaven's name the toothpaste is going to come out. So now with guilt submerged in the subconscious mind, and we get under pressures because of guilt, we don't know where it's going to come out. One way it may come out is in neuroses. I think one of the classical examples of neuroses was given to us by Shakespeare. Incidentally, in his great tragedy, Macbeth, you have a perfect example of neuroses in Lady Macbeth and psychoses in Macbeth himself. When did Shakespeare die? Now, 1616. Do you know, when I was in college, I had to learn the dates of all these English authors. I still remember them. Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, I think. Look it up to see. Well, Shakespeare in Macbeth, here over 400 years ago, showed the effect of repressed guilt. So Lady Macbeth, who has a neurosis of washing her hands, and the maidservant says she washes her hands every quarter of an hour. She sees blood on her hands. Why? Because she's murdered the King Duncan. There's no blood there. She sees spots. And she asks if all the waters of the 7 seas are not enough to wash this blood incarnadine from my hands. Now, there should have been in Lady Macbeth a very conscious washing away of guilt, admitting it and seeking pardon. There was none. Cap was kept on the tube. How did it come out? In washing her hands instead of washing her soul. That's one of the extraordinary manifestations of hidden guilt. Because we put it down in a kind of an emotional area. Another manifestation of it is dreams. Now, not all dreams, but the greatest psychiatrist who ever taught about dreams was Carl Jung. Carl Jung said that in his psychiatric experience, he examined about 25,000 dreams. And his theory is very interesting. His theory is that a dream is very often a revelation of our spiritual state. Our spiritual state. In other words, our conscious mind is making compensation, or rather the unconscious mind in the dream is making compensation for what we consciously repressed and denied. Take, for example, the woman who had a dream about a tree. She was looking out of her window, and she saw suddenly worms coming and attacking the tree, and the leaves began to wither. The trunk rotted, and it all fell. And Jung told her, well, this is nothing but the experience of your own life. It was the way that she was living. And this was symbolically a representation of her true spiritual and moral state. Now, another manifestation also is looking for a scapegoat. This is very common. In other words, someone to blame. And today, it's a great indoor sport to blame religion. churches, ministers, priests, and rabbis, and so forth, are not adequately caring for the needs of people, which indeed could be true in some instances. But there's a search for someone else to blame. And it will almost always be found that people who are discontent on the inside will always begin to blame somebody or something on the outside. So we say, oh yes, he grew up, there were no playgrounds around where he lived. That's why he's a thief today. Or he was raised on grade B milk. There weren't any dance halls. Scapegoat, never the self. Oh no, that's hidden because we live now in an irrational, emotional era. Now I could go on enumerating many more escapes through the tube under the pressure of the subconscious mind. Anyone who is skilled in a knowledge of human nature is not led very much astray by these escapes. Let me give you one or two experiences that I had. Not very long ago, a young woman wrote to me, a college student. She was a sophomore in college. She said, I've given up my faith. I no longer believe in God. And I am now an atheist and so forth. Well, it was curious, first of all, that she should have written to me. She lived in another city. I wrote to her and asked her to call on me. She was not a particularly intelligent young woman. And I said, how did you happen to lose your faith? In other words, I was asking her, what is the scapegoat? What's the excuse? She said, my studies in comparative religion. And we followed a class, and I found out all religions are alike. Well, sure. All the paintings in the gallery have the same color, but that doesn't mean that they were painted by the same artist. But at any rate, that was the reason she gave. I knew, of course, that was not the real reason. But I played along with it for a minute, and she was in my library, and I said, now, directly in back of you is a section of books on comparative religion. I have about 400 different titles on that subject. Now, you pick out any one of those books that you know, and we will discuss it. Now, glance them over. Well, she didn't know any of them, which didn't a bit surprise me. I said, my good girl, come in to confession. She says, how can I go to confession? I don't even believe in God. I said, listen, you're not having any difficulty with the creed. You have difficulties with the commandments. I said, why don't you face up to it? You've been immoral. In order to escape your sense of guilt, you wrote to me about being an atheist. Isn't that right? She said, yes, that's right. Well, she went to confession. She was all right. I think, as I've said before, we do not pay very much attention to what people say, but we pay attention to why they say it. Why? Now, another case. A woman told me about a brother of hers who had not worked for 3 years. His weight had gone down to about 100 pounds. He had been under psychiatric treatment for almost a year and was no better. Would I see him? The poor fellow came to see me. He was rather pitiable in his condition, and I asked him to tell me about himself, just talk for a half hour. And he talked generally for about a half hour. He said he didn't know the reason why he was this way. And suddenly I turned on him and I said, "How much did you steal?" He said, "I didn't steal anything." I said, "You did. How much?" He said, "I didn't steal anything." "You're calling me a thief." I said, "Yes, you are a thief. How much did you steal?" He said, $3,000. He said, "How did you know?" "Well," I said, "you were telling me about, I asked you all the queer things you did, namely where the toothpaste came out. And I noticed that among other things," he said, that whenever he would put money in the collection box in church, he would always wipe it off first. So I suspected that he had dirty money, and that's why I asked the question. I could have been wrong, but I just happened to hit it right. And after that, he cleared up. He went to work and admitted to the employer that he had stolen the money, and the employer took him back. And he gave back part of his salary, and now he's perfectly normal and healthy. So that today, people are not really free from guilt. It's just down in another part of their being. And this, as a matter of fact, has another effect. It is often said that today people are irreligious. Well, in a certain sense, maybe they are. But that is not altogether true. Religion has moved out of the conscious, rational, church-going, organizational religion down into the subconsciousness. That's where religion is. That's where the dramatists work on it. And that's where religion will have to begin to work on it. In other words, these people who are suffering from these submerged feelings of guilt, they have misery, yes, misery. They do not call it guilt. That is not important. Fact is, they're frustrated, they're distressed, they're in agony, they're pressed. And they often fall into result into despair. You know the answer? There are two things in this world that never should be separated: misery and mercy. If you have misery without mercy, you've got despair. If you've got mercy without misery, you have presumption. Our modern despair is not so bad after all. Shakespeare's quoted, "To thy own self be true," without deciding which self one is to be. You see, I heard many a woman say, "I must now put on my face." Did you ever hear that? I heard of one who said, "I must now put on my eyes. I must now put on my lips." Well, is one the same person with the new face, new eyes, new lips, without them? Some women need only two things to make them beautiful: soap and water. Others need many other things. I heard of a man who had a choice to marry an opera singer who was very ugly, sang beautifully, and an uneducated cook who was very beautiful. He finally decided that he had better marry the opera singer because she would give him more prestige. So it was decided. First morning after the honeymoon, woke up, took a look at the opera singer, and he said, "For heaven's sake, sing!" See, he had a problem, too, of the identity crisis. Much has been written about it, particularly by Erickson, and he restricted it to some extent to youth. But it is not a phenomenon that belongs to youth alone, this discovery of self. The young indeed have it because the young people do have a terrible crisis. A young person reaches an age where he wants to be himself. He separates from parents. I want to be an individual, but at the same time that he wants to be an individual, he wants to conform to what everyone else is doing. Wear the same clothes, talk the same language, love the same music. But old people have the crisis, too, of discovering which is self. The difference between the young and the old in an identity crisis is that the old in the identity crisis look back to deny the past and responsibility, and the young look to the future and deny the responsibility of the future. So both of them have trouble. Now I'm going to give you three kinds of, identity crises. The point is, and this is the reason we've chosen this telecast, is one must be careful in seeking identity to discover which self one really is. And I think that today I will ask my angel to leave all the writing on the blackboard, unless I change my mind, so that you can see the three. The first kind of crisis is this, where a person wears the mask but has no face. That is to say, a perpetual phony. There was someone who wrote a poem some years ago, and the poem was about a woman who was always seen holding a mask before her face. She held it sprightly and gaily. And one day someone pulled away the mask, and there wasn't any face. She was just her sham. So some say they are their true selves when they're only the mask. Take, for example, an alcoholic. An alcoholic is completely identified with his alcohol. He will say, well, this is my nature. I can't help it. It's the way I am. Or an LSD victim. They never try to get below that mask to discover their real self. It was just that made T.S. Eliot, the poet, speak of ourselves as being hollow men, straw men. And he says that when the world ends, the world that's full of hollow men, it will end not with a bang, but with a whimper. Some keep this masquerade, this phoniness, this hypocrisy so much before them that they would hardly recognize their true self if they met it. The Danish philosopher and theologian Kierkegaard told a very interesting story about a peasant who had saved up enough money to buy himself some new boots and new colored stockings. He came into town, bought the boots and the colored stockings. He had some money left, so he got drunk. And he threw himself in the curb. Funny how often drunks end in curbs, isn't it? I heard of one drunk who was walking along with his foot on the curb and the other in the gutter. And the cop came along and said, "You're drunk." He said, "Oh, thank God, I thought I was a cripple." Well, this, I'm sorry I interrupted the story. But at any rate, this drunk threw himself in the curb, and another peasant came along with a cart and horse, and he shouted to the drunk. He says, "Get out of the way. I'll run over you." And the drunk said, "I don't care. They're not my legs." He didn't know himself with his new boots and his new stockings. And he was just so much his old self that he couldn't tell the new. And that's the way people are with the mask without the face. They have no care for others. As Peer Gynt, in the work of Conrad, said, the people are sometimes met in mental institutions. He said they have no care for others. They live in a barrel of self, and they're corked with a bung of self. No concern, no love, no care. Like a priest was telling me some time ago, talking about not caring, about a former pastor years ago that bought a horse. And he said to the farmer, "Can it see all right?" "Oh, yes," he said. "It sees perfectly." "Can it run all right?" "Yes." So he picked up a stone. He threw it at the horse, ran like a racehorse. It ran right into a tree. And the priest said to the farmer, "I thought you said that the horse could see all right." He says he does, but he just doesn't give a darn. Well, that's the way people are. People are that wear the mask but no face. They have no care of others, no love of neighbor. They've lived in this make-believe world so long, and they say, "This is my true identity." That's why one has to be so careful about saying, "I must seek my identity." What kind of identity is one seeking? This kind of mockery has some bad effects. It has psychic effects, which cannot be ignored. There was a German war story told about a Jewish couple who had a son who was paralyzed. And they went to a neighbor, and they said to the neighbor, "We are Jews, we're going to be killed by Hitler. But we want you to take care of this paralyzed son of ours. We'll give you this house, we'll give you our property. But just care for him." The neighbor promised to do it. He killed the son, confiscated the property, and lived on it. And then a lump began to appear in the back of his neck. And he would press it, and it would come out on his forehead. And he'd press the forehead, come out on his chest. Press it there, it would come out somewhere else. So though people wear the mask, though they have this kind of makeup, they nevertheless are psychologically disordered on the inside until they discover their true self. But there's another step. And the second step is the mask. The mask that knows it has a face, though it is only a subconscious knowledge. See how good my angel is? He doesn't erase today. Remember other times I could go there and write something and immediately he would clean it. Have you ever been able to figure out why he doesn't erase some days? I'm not telling him. The angels are much wiser than men. And they're much wiser than anyone on a television show, too. Well, there's the mask that knows it has a face. I suppose a good example of this kind of identity crisis would be a woman who comes home from a ball, a dance. I didn't mean ball in the modern sense of the word. Dance, and she's been in evening clothes, has on jewels, and her hair was well adorned, and her eyes, maybe her eyelashes made long, and so on and so forth. She comes home, the dance is over, and she sits before the mirror, looks at herself. Maybe she says, I'm beautiful. This is the real me. That's the bad grammar, but that's what she might say. This is the real I. If she were a school teacher, she would say, or came from Boston. And yet she knows that in a little while she's got to take off that makeup. She knows there's a face under that. Maybe she'll put on another kind of face. I heard of a woman who put on so much cold cream and oil that she slid out of bed every night. Sorry. Now, people that are in this state have not discovered their true identity. They suffer from a tension and a pull and a duality between what they seem to be and what they really are. And they know that the mask and the face are not the same. They know the way they appear to others is not the way they are on the inside. Now, what's Freud's explanation of that tension and that anxiety? Well, Freud says people are anxious and unhappy because they wanted to do something and were afraid to do it. Remember his language about the id and the superego? The id, or the instincts and so forth. The id wants to do something and the superego says, no one crushed it, and they became very anxious. That's not the real reason. People have a tension, people of this kind, have a tension not because they wanted to do something and didn't do it, but because they did something and wish they hadn't, which is very, very different. Now let me give you an example of that, because this is particularly common, this attitude, among the young. A boy and a girl in college went out auto riding. And the boy was telling the girl, you know, it's marvelous how the world has changed. We're now in a universe of great freedom. All the old sex taboos have been done away with. We can put anything we want on the stage today and on television. And furthermore, we do not have to obey any of the old moral laws simply because any of the consequences of sex have been done away with. Psychology has told us not to be worried if we break what was formerly called a moral law. And so he argues and argues with the girl until he finally breaks down her virtue, as he did in this particular historical case. It happened. On the way back, he said, now let me give you a little advice. You must never tell anybody about this. Never. First of all, Never tell the man you're going to marry. Don't tell any girls in the dormitory. They won't like you, or they'll be suspicious of you, or they'll tell other boys, and then you'll just become common property among all of them. Then watch yourself. Look out for venereal diseases. All changed. Why did he say one thing on the way out and another thing on the way back? It was the mask on the way out. It was the face on the way back. So people know they have a mask, even when they deny it. And young people, college people at this age will sometimes become very aggressive in defense of the mask. And particularly against parents, when the parents correct them. They become very angry, much more angry than they should, and the reason is they're afraid of exposure. What are the parents going to do, tear off this mask? There are many other characteristics of this age, but I see I have only 6 minutes and 28 seconds to tell you, so we'll not be able to develop it. Then, too, we might also say in this connection, this is a dangerous thing to talk about, and I'm not complaining against social justice. May God grant us all social justice, but it can very well be that sometimes people are interested in social justice to cover up the want of individual justice. They will plead a great love of neighbor in order to cover up a want of true love on the inside. So these are the masks and the face. Now we come to the third and the last. Third and the last stage is where there is a mask and no face. This is identity. Now we come to the real self, but this is hard, to tear off that mask. Tearing off that mask in order to be one's true self, getting rid of all shams and pretenses and make-believes, almost puts one in exactly the same position as the Israelites before they went into the Promised Land. The spies they sent out came back, and they brought news of great abundance. Here were the grapes that were carried on poles by men. This is the fruit and abundance of this Promised Land. But on the other hand, they were told the walls went up to the heavens and the men were giants and as thick as grasshoppers. They wanted to go in, and they were afraid to go in. And so one wants to tear away the mask, and one is afraid to do it. But the moment one becomes unacceptable to self, that's the point. Unacceptable to self, one begins to be very acceptable to God. This was brought out very well, remember, in the woman taken in sin. Here the Pharisees had found the woman in adultery, so they said. Just think of the snooping that went on, huh? To have caught this woman in adultery. And here they bring her to our Lord. They said she should be stoned, which was indeed the Mosaic law. So was he going to be just and have her stoned, or was he going to be merciful? If he was merciful, he would disobey the law. What did he say? He said, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And he began to write. What we wrote, we do not know. But he looked at them. I think he looked at one of them through the mask, and he wrote the word thief. Looked at another, wrote the word murderer. Looked at another, tore off the mask, and wrote adulterer. And they left. They left one by one, beginning with the eldest. That's interesting. It was the older men who first tore off the masks, not the young. The old are more convertible, evidently. The old have passed through so much sham, they're ready to get rid of it. And then he said to the woman, "Woman, where are they that accuse thee?" She said, "They are not here, my lord." And he said, "Neither will I. Neither will I accuse thee." So her mask was torn away, and so was their mask. Let the young, therefore, who are seeking true identity, be sure of the identity that they seek, that it's not a mask, and they'll never discover their real self until they've gone through the troubling of the waters. It's only then that paralyzed souls are cured, like Augustine. And then it is, when the mask is off, that one can say with Augustine, our hearts are restless, restless, and they cannot find peace until they rest in thee, O Lord.
Bishop Sheen